Hi there, John Wilkinson here. Thanks for tuning in to my History Made Easier channel. I hope in some blundering way I'm being of some use. And in this little video, I want to talk about power. A concept that covers just about everything on our history programme, from the very personal level to the huge sweeps of history. Power is at the heart of what we look at. So what exactly is power? Well, power is the ability to make decisions, the ability to make policies, the ability to affect behaviour, the power of governments or individuals to do that to other people. Think about it. The power to make decisions. Decisions like whether to go to war or not. That's a pretty important power our governments have. The power to make policies. Policies like cutting spending on welfare provision or expanding spending on welfare provision. They are issues that will affect millions of people, fundamentally affect their lives. The power to change behaviour, increase interest rates. I'm likely to borrow less money and so spend less money. Reduce interest rates and I'm more likely to borrow money and spend that money. It affects my behaviour. It matters. So power. Now we look at power as legitimate power and as illegitimate power. Legitimate power comes from constitutions, comes from elected governments, comes from our police forces, our law courts. All of these are legitimate sources of power. We loan power to our governments every time we elect them, and we take them back temporarily during an election campaign when we decide who else will govern us. But those powers that we hand over have to be dealt with responsibly. It's okay. We want a police force. We want law courts. They make us feel safe, so long as those powers are not abused. So we come to illegitimate power. Well, illegitimate power is the power of the gun. If I held a gun to you, I would have power over you. But it's hardly legitimate power, is it? So we have the power of the gun. We have arbitrary arrest, being arrested for having a different viewpoint, being arrested for peacefully protesting. Countries do that. We would regard it as the illegitimate use of power. The power to remove our civil rights, and then we're defenceless. These are all illegitimate sources of power. I think you'd agree with me there. So, where do we see this across the history that we might be looking at? Well, we see the power of the military in wars and the power of one country to impose its will over a weaker country. We see it in the abuse of military power. Think about the rape of German women by the Russian army as it forced its way into Germany at the end of World War II. Think about the massacre at My Lai in Vietnam. And we see this kind of thing even more in civil wars. Civil wars tend to be even more bitter, with a more profound breakdown of the rules of law than we get in nation against nation. Civil wars are usually quite brutal. So we see power as fundamentally important when we study wars. Think about the power of governments again. We look at whether governments are seen as having legitimate power, and we might have revolutions trying to overthrow what we see as illegitimate power. I look at that when I study Tsarist Russia, for example. And if we look at Tsarist Russia, we can also cover a really fundamentally important economic power. The relationship between the owners of power and the workers, if you like. Because in Tsarist Russia, we had serfdom, where people actually owned human beings and could sell them, could even pay off their debts with their serfs. That is power. And we see it in all economic relationships. We see it in trade unions fighting for better conditions, fighting for more pay. This is a power relationship that we see. So power in the economy, in the workplace. We see power in sweeping movements, liberalism, sweeping away monarchical rule in 18th century, 19th century Europe. We see it in nationalism, sweeping away imperial power. We see it in socialism, in communism, trying to sweep away the power of capitalism. So we see it in these big movements as well. And we see it in we see the power relationships in dictatorships, where freedoms are removed from people, those civil rights that I talked about earlier. We see power relationships in the way the secret police operate, the way purges are undergone. These are all power relationships. And so I hope I've shown that power is something that we shouldn't just rush over and look at the actual detail of what's going on. We should think about this concept that's behind what we're looking at in history. Power. The power to make decisions, to make policies, to change the behaviour of people. It's so important. I will write this up, as I tend to do, and pop it on my website, History Made Easier, on the short pieces. But for now, as always, thank you so much for listening. Cheers.